Hey everybody, Steve and Kelly here from Sculpting Stone. Kelly's manning the camera. Today let's just talk about, generally speaking, the wealth of tools available and some of our favorites when we're working. We hope that this is an ongoing dialogue with the community that we're creating here with Sculpting Stone. So if any of you have different tools that you use, which you like, we hope that you write and tell us about them and we'll look into them ourselves. And if you have any specific questions about things you see here or that we touch upon lightly, follow up with us by messaging us and we'll get back to you. If you're learning sculpture, you do want to have a good control of hammer and chisel before you get into these kinds of tools, because this is the siren that draws everybody. The power tools are easier to use right off the bat. You don't have to do anything other than hold them and maneuver them. They seem to remove stone a lot faster than you can do on your own. But what ends up happening is that if you do those first, before you learn your hammer and chisel, you're going to handicap yourself for that later. Okay, so let's dive into it. Most of what I'm talking about here relates to marble carving and softer stones like alabaster and limestones. Okay, so there's a range of different different size blades. Obviously, this is a 12-inch, which is not really used as much. That goes. I use that on a 9-inch grinder. This is a 9-inch blade, and then there's an assortment of cutting blades. I don't know in inches exactly what these are, but these all go on a smaller grinder, okay? So just to show you guys the difference, for those of you who may not know, this is a 9-inch grinder, and this would be a 4.5 or a 5-inch grinder. So there are 7-inch grinders as well. We don't have them here in the shop, and I'm not sure how useful they are. However, I did want to mention a couple of things about these brands, only because I've tried several and I've burnt out a lot, and I know ones that seem to hold up are Metabo, Bosch, and Makita. Now, there have been some questions about the quality of some of these coming out, and sometimes they're produced in different places. You'll have to look into that, but what seems to work for us and hold up for us are these. I've never had a problem with a Metabo, and they cost more, but the way I work is I would prefer to have something that's not going to fail on me. Okay. So getting back to the cutting blades, we have the 12-inch, we have the 9-inch, we have an assortment of smaller ones, and then we get into some specialty blades, which I'll talk about. This is also sort of cutting and grinding. It's shaped, it's got the little teeth in it, like a cutting blade, but it is not much larger than a flange, and that it can be useful for some small grinding and shaping purposes. And then the next row over here are planing discs. As you can see, most of the surface is covered in diamond, and that's extremely useful for doing what you think it would do, which would be planing something down, flattening a surface, leveling something if you have a base that you need to make flat. But you can also use smaller diameter versions of this and use that for shaping as well if you're doing some roughing out, okay? And we'll talk about the rough out process, whether you're using saws and abrasives like this or doing it percussively. There are different ways of working, but I just wanted to mention that. There are also some specialty tools you can get, like for example, this small little planing blade does in fact screw onto a small angle grinder. It's got a 5/8 11 spindle here, and that can also be used for doing shaping. Okay, last row are discs which are used, sort of cup wheels, which are used for grinding, okay? And you can see we have a variety of sizes and shapes, different profiles here, okay? Some are round and then completely flat on the bottom. Others take on more of a donut shape, okay? And then we have one that is almost semi-spherical, which we use for concavities and bowls and things like that. Okay, and all of these again go on the angle grinder. And I should mention that a couple things. You can get these in different grit diamonds. Okay, this is a particularly aggressive grit. Okay, and the grits more or less correspond to sandpaper, or you can get finer grit ones as well. And then lastly, there's this beast here, which I don't use unless I'm working on something quite sizable, and this I use on the large angle grinder. Let's get into die grinders. So after angle grinders, we have die grinders, which are extremely useful And you can have big, beefy electric die grinders like this. Die grinders, I should mention, if you don't know this, take tools, okay, like Burrs that can be inserted here. Usually they have a 1/4 inch, or in this case, 6mm spindle, okay, and then you tighten this collet, and then this will spin, and you can use it for shaping things, or excavating holes in other areas. Very useful. And we'll get into all that in a separate episode, but you can get electric versions, and then if you have a strong enough air compressor, you can get an air version, okay? These do require a lot of air. It's almost as if you take your air hose and just cut it off and let the air flow. So if you don't have the right size tank, and especially a large motor, then you might want to look into getting yourself something electric instead. But there's all different sizes and shapes. And then when you get into pneumatic ones, air-powered ones, you can get smaller ones because, of course, you don't need all the electrical components that are necessary for something like this. So you can get little handheld ones. And then there are small ones like this, these little pen grinders. And these take a 3mm shank. So you can see there's a whole assortment of burrs that exist with a smaller shank. And this gets down to working like a dentist. I mean, this thing, if this is made well and you want, it's better to invest in a good brand that is not going to give you any kind of vibration. This should spin without any sort of wobble or blurriness when you're looking at it. It looks like it's just sitting still in space. And you can do very, very delicate work with these. Okay, all different sizes and shape burrs as well. Yeah, and I guess I should address that with the larger diameter. I mean, you can get, things from olive shape to complete spheres. Spheres are especially useful for digging holes, or getting deep into areas because they spin uniformly, so you can plunge them quite well. And then there's all kinds of pointed tips, and you can even get small blades, for getting in and, doing all kinds of things. It really depends on, again, what you want to make. Someone who's working a lot of architectural things might not have as much of a use for this. People who are making abstract sculpture might need broader tools, if they're making larger forms. And people who are doing figurative work might not use these tools at all because they find that they destroy the form and they want to have more control by using chisels. In addition to the diamond tools, okay, we have the traditional silica carbide bits, or burrs, I should say, that also can go into these die grinders, right? And there's a couple of advantages and disadvantages to each type. I would say that the diamond is going to last longer, and it allows you to achieve many more forms, especially smaller and pointier forms that you can't achieve in this kind of manufacturing process, because this conglomerate of artificial abrasive stone will just fall apart if it's too small, right? But on the other hand, you need to have a solid metal core to hold this diamond on it, right? So you can't get this large with it without this thing kinking and, and being ruined. It's going to be way too heavy. So these stones are actually fairly light. The other advantage is that these are a lot more economical than these diamond bits. I bet these are probably 1/10 the cost of these, okay? So that might be a better option for people. And certainly, again, you can get larger varieties, depending on the things that you're working on in the stone version than in the diamond version. Okay, one thing here for angle grinders are specialized bits, which again have a 5/8 11 female arbor, which can go right on the angle grinder. Okay, and those can be used with a lot more torque than a die grinder to get in and to route out things. And to sum up on diamonds, let's just talk about these rasps here. For those of you who know about traditional rasps, I'll just pull one out here. Traditional stoneworking rasps are made out of steel, and they have all these little teeth on them. And we're going to talk about that. I'm including this in the chisel section because all the steel tools are sort of a separate thing, but just for the purposes of comparison, I wanted to pull this out. So these little teeth here that have been raised off the surface are what create the abrasion, right, when you're refining a piece of stone. And we have that replaced by Diamond on these traditional shapes or these custom shapes. This is a piece of rebar that I actually shaped and then had coated with Diamond, but this is all electroplated as well. So you can have traditional forms, you can have different sizes and shapes, you know, from something large like this to something super tiny, okay, like this. Dental tools, you can have something flexible coated in Diamond. So for example, this is a hacksaw blade, which I shaped and then had electroplated. So it's actually good for flat surfaces, but also you can wrap it around something. And I also had that done with a piece of steel here. And believe it or not, this has come in quite handy on a couple of different projects. If you have to plane something or get into a tight corner, but then also I've had to use it on a large convex surface, and that was extremely useful. Okay, so let's move off of diamonds for a moment and talk about sort of some of the materials that we would use when we're abrading, probably towards, you know, finishing our sculpture. First, to take a step back, technologically speaking, are just these abrasive stones, okay? So this is like 36 grit, 60 grit, 80 grit. You can go all the way down to definitely at least a 220 grit on these. But these are extremely useful. You buy them in wheels and then you can break them up into sections like this. And the great thing about these is that as you are working on your sculpture, they are wearing down at the same rate. So you start to get these weird kind of organic forms that conform to the surface that you're working. And for people who have studied with me, you know what I'm talking about. The problem is that I have not found a good source for these outside of Italy. So if anyone out there does know, please let me know. There are many places that sell abrasive stones in the United States and in North America, but they tend to be bound together. This is all artificial. These are artificial granules that have some kind of binder that holds them together. The way they're produced here is that they're held together so tightly that when you're working with them, they retain their flat shape. They don't wear down, which seems like a benefit because it's not wearing away and you don't have to buy more so quickly. But it's actually not so great for sculpture because you end up flattening the form that you've made. You want something that actually wears down and conforms to the surface that you're working. That's ideal. These are indispensable in my practice. And I will tell you that this fills in a very important step between chiseling and cutting and getting onto sandpaper. This is what's going to remove the marks from a diamond disc or from, you know, an errant chisel mark or a little bit of bruising. You want to get past that with something like this. You can use rasps too, but this works much, much faster. Okay, let's talk about sandpapers, okay? There are two different ways that you would get into using sandpaper. One would be power tools and the other would be traditionally, you know, working by hand. I'll address power tools first. If you're working on something that's large enough to merit using an angle grinder, there are backing pads that you can buy that screw onto the angle grinder, and then you can affix sandpaper, okay, to the other side. Now, there are different ways of doing this. In our studio, we tend to use hook and loop or Velcro, okay? And that way you can just take a piece of sandpaper at whatever grit you need. This is 60, and stick it on, okay? And then use that. And there are different types of these backing pads. So you can get some, this is, for example, has a rigid plastic red top and then this blue foam that gives it a little bit of cushion if you're, you know, softening an edge. There's completely rigid ones, more flexible ones. Okay, this is, as you can see, completely bends to conform like if you were getting into a concavity. And then there are ones which are hard but also have an angle on it. And you can actually get into using pieces. There are tricks like using a larger piece of sandpaper, and this will wrap up to conform to the shape of the disc that you're using, depending on where you're working. And we'll get into that in a full-on episode. You can also get backing discs like this, which would go onto the angle grinder. You have a nut that screws on, and that would hold on very thick discs like this, for instance, this is a Zec disc, which is 16. So, and then lastly, there's just sandpaper. So after we're done with our stones, typically, or rasping, we'll get into using sandpaper. And these, you want to make sure that you get the gray, which is silicon carbide. Silicon carbide works best with stone. The red sandpaper, aluminum oxide, that's for metal. The yellowish, sandy colored sandpaper is for wood. You want to get this stuff. And typically it can be used either wet or dry.